Good morning. Time now 8 a.m. on Friday, December 13th, 2024 in Japan Standard Time. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Online Morning Seminar. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize these online morning seminars to introduce latest World Bank report in timely manner presented by the authors of those reports. This morning, we have a pleasure of having Matias Herrera Dappe joining us from Washington, who is a senior economist in the World Bank, presenting the latest report, Shrinking Economic Distance, Understanding How Markets and Places Can Lower Transport Costs in Developing Countries. The report was issued in the middle of September this year, so very new report. We'll listen to the presentation by Matthias for next 35-40 minutes or so about the report. And then following his presentation, I'll read a question that we received in advance from the viewers. If you did not have opportunities to send your questions in advance, please send your questions by using the online form posted on the announcement page of this seminar announcement, or you can simply send your question directly to me by email, or you can post your questions on the chat section of the YouTube screen. I'll read your questions on your behalf, asking Matthias to make responses and comment. So with this introduction, I would like to now formally invite Matias Herrera Dappe, the senior economist in the World Bank, to present the main point of the report, Shrinking Economic Distance, Understanding How Markets and Places Can Lower Transport Costs in Developing Countries. Matias, please come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi, for the introductions and the invitation. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So let me move the slides, make sure it works. Okay, so if we look at the transportation costs for international shipments, that's shipment between countries, and we look all the way back until probably around the late 1800s, so or specifically we have data about from 1870 onwards, and we see a clear trend on the reduction of the international transport cost, whether by weight or value, except for a few periods in the history of this century and a half, that around the two world wars, World War First and Second, and then in some other particular events which can all relate to COVID pandemic and a few years ago, where maritime shipping cost and other type of transport cost went up quite significantly because of the shocks to the supply chain. So, but overall, the trend has been a downward trend, decreasing across this period, which, as you all know, had allowed the developing countries and in the whole economy, not just developing countries, but also developed countries, to trade significantly more, and had led to increases not just in trade in general, but also to global value chains that had allowed countries to participate in global markets in different manners, by final products or at different stages of production of goods. So, but even though that has happened, and particularly in East Asia, you will know better than others how the whole region and some countries more than others had benefited significantly by the lower transportation cost and by integrating themselves to global markets. We still today have that developing countries, and particularly if you want to think about, as we define in the World Bank, low and middle income countries, they face much higher transportation cost and times for both their international shipments and domestic shipments than high income countries. And so what we call here the economic distance, that it's not that we came up with that term, that's a term that already existed and was brought up by other authors before. It is the economic distance, meaning the transport cost and time that the shippers have to incur in order to move their goods. And the point of this term is that it's not about how far you are in terms of kilometers or miles on the physical distance, but what it matters at the end is how much you had to pay, what's the cost to get to where you want to send your products. And the time, because time is money at the end. When the goods are stopped somewhere, there's money that it's been not been earned. So there's an opportunity cost. But well, bottom line is that even though international shipping costs have gone down significantly over the last century and a half, still today, developing countries face much higher cost and times than developed countries, which impedes them to better integrate to global value chains and to global markets in general. And again, just to reiterate, and I'll show you a few uh, data points now, like two or statements to back up this statement that I'm making here, which is one of the main first messages of the report, is that it's not only about international shipments, but it's important to think about that also domestic shipments, and why that is important. They are much more expensive, and I'll discuss that. Why is that? So, and let me start providing some statistics from in terms of the time. Why and what I mean by saying that transport times are much higher in developing countries than in developed countries. So we can start by looking at the typical measures of border times, the time that takes to clear borders in different countries. And here we have it aggregated them in terms of like income level, low, middle, and high income countries for both export and imports. And we could see just how much higher they are in low income countries than in middle income countries, and particularly than in high income countries, with the average time to clear the borders in low income countries be about like 4 times longer than in high income countries. So it's not like a few more hours, but it's just like 1 day versus 4 days, basically. That's what it takes. However, one can claim that shippers, when they know that the time to clear a border is high, they can plan accordingly, taking into account, okay, in these countries it will be 3 more days than in this other country. Let's plan our supply chain and our logistics around that, and it will be costly, but we can be fine with that. However, another serious problem is that border times are not only long, but they are also highly uncertain. In this figure, we have evidence from Africa, but we know from different data sources that we have that it happens all across the world. So this figure shows you the bars is the median time that imports spend at borders in African countries, and the whiskers provide the 25 and 75 percentile. So you see there is a huge variation, like in Burundi, where the median time is 30 days that imports spend at the border, but on the 75 percentile is about 60 days, so double the median, and that variation from like the less around 5 days being the 25 percentile, and as I said, 60 days, the 75 percentile, is such a variation creates a lot of uncertainty, which also costs a lot of money for importers and exporters in order to ship and sell their goods. But that you might say, okay, it's not something new that we already knew that. So let's move then to ports. And most of the car, I mean, not most of the car in terms of volume, but in terms of value, moves through containers and therefore container ports. And if we look at the time that container ships spend in ports, we see also a clear correlation with the income level. Low-income countries, in low-income countries, ports in low-income countries, the vessels spend about, the median time is about twice that of high-income countries. And on middle-income countries, it's about 50% more than in high-income countries. So it's not only the time to clear the borders in a country, but it's also the time that the vessel gets to the port and needs to wait to enter, let's say, terminal, and be at one of the berths, and then be serviced to get the cargo offloaded, and let's say the imports and the export to be loaded into the vessels. It takes significantly longer in low-income countries and also in middle-income countries. But then that we could think about, this is relevant metrics for export and imports if the imports are only meant to be arrived to the coastal city and the exports are produced in the coastal city. But that's not the case in all the countries. And actually, there's a lot of countries in many regions, and many of them in Africa, that they are landlocked. So they had to travel significant time to get to the final destination or to get from where they're produced to the ports. So another thing that we look at is about the speed of travel within countries, and basically the speed of travel between the main economic centers, and I would say even more than main economic centers, the cities that they are have about a population of 50,000 people or above. And we see also there that the average speed of travel within countries, each of these data points is a country, and we have 130 something countries here. So the speed of travel within the country is also strongly correlated with the level of income, with basically high income countries, vehicles traveling at a speed that is 2 times that of low income countries. So all over is not just like clearing the borders, time at the ports, but also the speed within the country, that in low income countries, that this much lower speed means that the integration of the country, the different regions, provinces of the countries are not well integrated, and that therefore leads that even if you integrate with global markets, so some regions of the country will benefit more than others because of this slow speed as and lack or difficult or minimal integration, I would say, in these countries. If we move to thinking about, okay, that is those statistics in terms of time, what it tells us, as I said before, is about the opportunity cost of this cargo, or the time-related cost of moving cargo. If we look at the monetary cost, what like shippers paid for their service, for either hiring transport services or for operating their own transport assets, and we look at exports from, in this case, I will provide statistics of low-income countries to the US, but we could use other high-income countries as the destination markets. In the case of the US, we see that the cost of exports for low-income countries to the US, it's almost 60% more expensive than from high-income countries. And that is not because low-income countries are further away, or because they ship different type of goods, or of different types and different weights. Taking that into account and basically comparing apples to apples, we see that still low-income countries pay a close to 60% premium to ship their exports to the US. And as I said, using other destination countries, we see also that there's a significant premium. Now, you might think, oh, in some cases, and there's evidence that in some countries, this higher cost comes because of the maritime leg, that the shipping rates are much higher in some countries than others. But if we only look at the domestic leg of the trip from origin to destination, and so we only focus into the domestic leg of this export shipment, we see that the cost of transport in that leg in low-income countries is 100% more expensive than in high-income countries. So it's double. It's significantly more expensive. Think about goods that are produced in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. The leg of the trip all the way to Chittagong, the main port, to be exported to other markets, or from Delhi to Mumbai or to Kolkata to reach the ports and be exported to other countries. So that leg, taking into account the distance, is not because in some countries like India, the distance is much larger, but like comparing basically, as I said, apples to apples, we see that the low-income countries pay a significant premium from that leg. And that, which as we will discuss later, is related to the low speed and many other factors that we will discuss, that is something that governments of developing countries can deal with it. They can tackle more than deal with it, in order to try to remove and tackle the sources of those premiums. Now, if we look not just at that leg for export imports, but we look at the cost of moving goods within countries across all of different cities there in a country. And we have done that for a few countries where we have data, some African countries and some Eastern European countries. We see that the cost of distance in those countries is about 3 to 14 times higher than in the US. So it's not just a little more, it's significantly much higher. And that it's many authors show and claim and then show that the high domestic or within country cost in some of these African countries, it's one of the reasons why Africa hasn't been able to take as much advantage as other countries in terms of integrating with global markets, even though over the several decades that trade tariffs have gone down, still the high transport costs have impeded the countries to take a full advantage of the integration with global markets or the globalization. Now, in the report, we look at the two main modes of transportation for cargo. The main mode on overland is, as you probably know, it's trucking, where in most countries is somewhere over 80% of the cargo is moved through trucks. Some countries that they have like good railway network, like India, still trucking is the main mode of transport. And then we focus on maritime shipping, which is the main mode of transport for international shipping. And in the case of tracking, so then we go deeper and we spend a bit more time, and I would say, on tracking in the report, because it's an area that has been studied a lot, but where we still, because of data constraint, we know a lot less than what we know in terms of international or maritime shipping cost. And what we know usually is more like anecdotal, I would say, or case by case studies, like different countries. And here we are able to compare like several countries together. And so we were lucky to have very good data on contract tracking prices to ship food in selected countries that was provided by the World Food Program. And as you know, they deliver food to a large number of countries facing food insecurity across the world, with a significant share of the countries that they work on being in Africa and some cases in Middle East and some in Asia. And so we have data that there is comparable, because it's the same institution that have been hiring the same sort of transport services across all these countries. And one thing that we could see from this data, and you have it in this figure, is like, first, the bars are the median tracking price per ton kilometer, and the whiskers provide again the 25 and 75 percentile. So there is quite a dispersion across countries. You could see that the comparing Mali to Zimbabwe and to extremes and other countries in the middle, that there's quite a difference in terms of the tracking prices. But also, as you could see, these whiskers in each of the countries are in some cases not too large, but in many countries are quite big. So meaning that there is a huge dispersion on the tracking rates within country. And that tells us that, yes, there are factors that they vary across countries, but a lot of the factors that determine the tracking prices are more specific to the countries and more specific to different routes and different markets within the countries. And so the colors, as you already saw, identify countries that face conflict and countries that don't face conflict. And so there's sort of a pattern that countries with conflict the tracking prices are more expensive than in countries without conflict. And when we look at the data with some more, not just visually, but with some statistical methods, we can find out that 75% of the variation in our data, and our data is about 60,000 shipments of goods. So 75% of the variation is within countries, and only 25% is between countries, which goes to the point that I just made a minute ago, where I said that the variation comes from a lot of factors that are more specific to the countries and to particularly the different routes within the country. And just to give you a sense, since I mentioned conflict, we find out that it's about between 3 and 7% average premium per ton kilometer that is paid in order to deliver food in areas with conflict. So it's not an irrelevant premium that in this case, WFP had to pay to deliver food. And you can translate that to other entities that had to, and companies that operate in those environments. Now, the transport price, as I have been saying, the same way as the transport time and reliability, it's an outcome of the interaction between the shippers that want to ship goods and the carriers or the service providers that want to deliver that service to move those goods from A to B. Now, let's focus about prices at the moment. These prices, they are an outcome of the market interaction between these two parties. And those are influenced by many different factors. The geography of the country or the specific route, meaning the distance, the elevation of the routes and things like that, the weather in the area, the infrastructure in place, the equipment and labor that in each country or each market can be found, like meaning like, for example, the trucks that are available, the drivers and other workers that are needed, the skills that they have, the policies and regulations set by the country, not only related to transport, but also to trade, and let's say the fiscal policy that set taxes and tariffs, and the market structure, the intensity of the competition in the particular market. Also, the information available. You have, like in many cases, and I'll discuss later, shippers that want to send goods from A to B, and carriers that are also in the origin in that location A, and they want to do the same trip, but they cannot find each other. And so that leads to inefficiencies and cost. And also the economic geography that leads to where the economic activity is located and distributed across the country and across the world, that leads to the influence the demand of the cargo. It's one of the main determinants, but also influence the way that the service providers operate. So all these forces interact together in very complex ways that I just try to simplify it as much as possible, but they interact and they give, basically the output is the outcome is the transport price, let's say. So in the report, we look in detail to a lot of different evidence of research that we have done and research that's been done by other people and other institutions. And in order to try to understand what are the way we say, frictions that keep the transport prices and time higher than what will be an efficient level and the reliability low. So we try to disentangle that by using examples from different countries. And so if I were going to jump, fine, I told you that the economic distance, the transport time and cost in developing countries is much higher than in developed countries, and just gave you a sense about that there are many different factors. So if I get to the end of almost the end of the report and I said, and someone asked me, how can the economic distance be reduced? Well, the evidence that we have there, we can summarize it by saying there are two key areas where governments should focus in order to remove the frictions, keeping the economic distance high. And those two are, first, creating efficient markets. It's important to have efficient markets along the entire transport supply chain. And that is not just markets for transport services, but also the markets for the inputs that are needed to deliver those services, to provide those services, meaning, for example, the labor markets, the markets for drivers, or the markets for vehicles, that many times the trucks available in developing countries are not the same that are available in developed countries, or at the much higher cost, and like the parts that need to be used for repair and so on. And so by efficient markets, we mean markets where, like, both the service providers, the workers, and the suppliers have the incentives and the ability to invest, innovate, increase productivity, and supply the best possible goods and service at the lowest possible price. But also that the consumers, the buyers of the goods and the service, can find what they need at affordable prices, right? The second element is, or the second area I would say, is that countries need to focus on developing efficient places. What do we mean by that? Well, develop the right infrastructure in the right place, the roads, the railway links, the waterway links, the ports, the stations, the border posts, that are so in a way that they are placed where they need to be placed to remove the frictions of distance or the frictions created by the agglomeration of economic activity that leads to congestion. So that, but it's not only to have the right infrastructure in the right place, but that the right infrastructure be operated efficiently. Because we know in many cases that the infrastructure is there, but it's inefficiently operated, what leads to higher cost. And that's what I'm going to share with you in a moment. So in the report, we go deeper. It's not that just we said, oh, creating efficient markets and developing efficient places, but we go deeper, and I would say in two levels. First, under each of these two areas, we have like 3 different high-level actions. And under each of those actions, or high-level actions, we have very detailed menus of possible policy actions for countries to pick. And we discuss experience on each of those cases from different countries in terms of what has worked and what not. And so, for example, in creating efficient markets, it's about strengthening the competition for and in the market, promoting the development of efficient transport providers, and promoting demand aggregation. So we have more detailed recommendations than what I'm sharing with you now. But now I'm going to get into each of these two areas and give you a bit of a flavor of the evidence that we have in order to come up with these conclusions and these recommendations. So when we talk about creating efficient markets, and as I said, well, it's importance to strengthen the competition for and in the market. One of the important things is about letting the market to determine the prices of the transport services. We know because of a lot of evidence and that, for example, in the case of the US and Mexico in the 80s, they deregulated the trucking markets in both countries at different times, but close to each other. And there were significant benefits in terms of like lowering tracking prices, improving the quality of the services, the sectors per se expanding, and the impact that had on the trade within the countries and the exports. However, there's still many countries, many developing countries, that regulate the prices for tracking services. And some cases are, I mean, in different regions, but there's also, we have very nice evidence from Colombia, where the government has been regulating the tracking prices by setting floors, the minimum price that can be paid for different trips. And at some point, those price floors were set too high. That led to a reduction on the amount of cargo that was being shipped, and therefore like a constraint on the economy, on the manufacturing and agricultural sector of the country, that led to significant social losses to the country. So it's not just the impact on the shippers and the carriers per se on the trucking sector, but on the entire economy. The other element is about that needs to be tackled in order, or actions need to be taken in order to create the efficient markets and competition in order to lead to efficient outcomes of these markets, is to remove formal and informal entry barriers. So there are many countries still today that don't allow that, for example, truck companies, tracking service providers from a neighboring country enter the country. Let's just take the clear example of like India and Bangladesh. Indian trucks cannot enter Bangladesh, and Bangladeshi trucks cannot enter India. So that, not only in South Asia, but in many parts in Africa and in Latin America, it's also it's a common problem. And there's nice evidence how that, in the case of Central America, led to much higher prices in the trucking sector, and because of a significant markup that the tracking companies could charge because of the limited competition. We also see in our data for shipping foods that crossing borders is quite expensive. There's a 70% premium that needs to be paid on average, and that premium is lower when the tracking markets are open to competition from the neighboring countries. So that is very nice evidence that we have in terms of formal removing, I mean, the cost of formal restrictions or entry barriers. But there are also informal barriers, meaning that they are not written in any law or regulation, that constrain the entry or hinders the entry to the market. And for example, in Bangladesh and similar in West African countries, there are very powerful trucking associations that don't allow everybody to access cargo. It had to be part of the trucking association, and it has to follow certain rules and charge the prices that the association determine, and that limits who can access cargo in order to provide the service. So there's constraints on entry to the market and in the sense of access to business. And so those are barriers and that we strongly believe that need to be removed to increase the efficiency of the market. Also, in some countries, there is competition is not very strong. Even like if there are, there might not be some of these barriers. Sometimes there's collusion and cartels, and that also increases the price, as you know. But it's important not just to increase competition for the sake of increasing competition. It's important that the service providers that they are in the market, they are, they are efficient. They are able to provide high quality services, able to take advantages of open markets where they can invest and increase productivity and so on, that they get remunerated for doing that. But so they need to have certain level of capacity and certain level of sophistication in order to benefit for that and being able to grow. And so we have evidence that in India, in routes where like financially mature service providers participate, that the prices are also lower than in other routes. Also, infrastructure plays a role here. If you have, let's say, the trucking sector has competition from other modes like rail, then that puts pressure on the markets to be more competitive, to charge lower prices. So because at the end, the market is for moving goods, it's not the market for moving goods on the road. But so if you have other alternatives, then there is more competition for those goods or that cargo that needs to be transported. Or sometimes you have routes that they are very far away and they are hard to reach. So in those routes, there will be few truckers providing services and maybe with like old and dilapidated trucks. But when the infrastructure allows easier connectivity to those routes, then more companies and maybe of higher quality. I mean, we have evidence that that is the case in Colombia, of companies of higher, better quality provide the service on those routes, and therefore lowers the prices of the trucking services provider. So there's a role for infrastructure to create efficient markets. And there's also an issue I have talked about trucking a lot now, but it's also in the case of maritime shipping, in the case of container ports, where we see that there's still a large number of ports across the world where there is only a single operator of all the terminals in the port. Some are small ports that, yes, it doesn't make sense to have more than one, but many large ports where there's also a single operator. And also ports that sometimes the competition, not just in the port, but competition not within the port, but competition from other ports is not limited. So that low intensity of competition leads to, or is associated with, much higher maritime shipping cost for export. So it's important that the competition is also not just in the trucking sector or the maritime sector, but also in the port sector. It's important. The last point I want to make on the creating efficient market is it's about, removing some restrictions and improving the demand aggregation and matching of shipper and carriers. What I mean by this, there is significant evidence that shows that vessels and trucks travel around the world empty for a significant share of the kilometers that they travel. So at some nice statistics is that at any time there's about 42% of bulk carriers vessels travel without cargo. And the median rate of empty truck kilometers is about 30% higher in low and middle income. It's about 30% in low and middle income countries, which is about 50% higher than in high income countries. So somebody has to pay for that cost of these, let's say, trucks traveling empty. And what it happens is like that, if a trucker has to go from A to B, and at point B, they know that they're not going to be able to pick up any cargo and they had to return empty. So the trip just to get to A to B is going to be much more expensive than if they have a possibility of finding a return cargo. So they will charge much more on the front load in order to recover the cost from the empty backhaul. And that is because in some cases there are these restrictions that don't allow like trucks or vessels to pick up cargo in the destinations. And sometimes it's because of the economic geography that there's trade and freight float imbalances. But also sometimes there's what I mentioned earlier, like shippers and carriers that they don't find each other. And so they, even though there is an opportunity to trade between them, they don't find each other, and the carrier has to return or empty or go somewhere else empty to find business. So that those inefficiencies are driving the cost. And we have evidence about like how important these restrictions are and what is the potential impact on tracking prices. So for the sake of time, I'll keep moving to the actions to develop efficient places. So as I mentioned before, we said about developing efficient places about first developing adequate infrastructure. So in some cases, the adequate infrastructure means, or not having adequate infrastructure is that the routes are too long, that in order to reach a destination, they had to go to some not very direct direction way, and they had to go around, and it takes much longer. So we see that in data that we have for shipping food, that I shared with you before, if we were going to come up with like more direct routes, meaning, and we were going to like save, let's say 100 kilometers on that route, on the median route that we have in our data, there will be an about 20% reduction in the total tracking price to get to the destination. Of course, cutting 100 kilometers from a route that it's only 200 kilometers is one thing, versus one that it's 1,000 kilometers, it's a different thing. And so, and the length of each route varies by country because of the size of the country, because of the needs to ship goods in the different countries. But so the 20% is an average effect, but which varies across countries, and you kind of sort of see in that figure that I have in that slide. But the bottom line is like, you know, more shorter routes can reduce the cost of infrastructure of transportation, but not everywhere the route can be reduced. In many countries, it's not an option already because the shortest route is there, but it might be because the route doesn't provide a proper service level. So we know that we have evidence that if shipments goes through highways, I mean, and highways is not necessarily what we mean by highways is like, the roads of the highest classification in a country. It's not the same, when don't think about the highways that you have, let's say in Japan or in the US or maybe or in China, but it could be, it's like the highest level of road classification of road in each country. And so driving through those roads versus driving through secondary or tertiary roads is much cheaper that through highways, or I mean primary roads, than secondary or tertiary. That's what we also show, for example, as a point of like the service level of the infrastructure, the quality, what we mean by adequate. Also, we see that there is a higher premium during the rainy season. So, and that premium is much higher in countries that they have a low quality of their road infrastructure versus countries with a high quality of the road infrastructure. So developing roads that can deal with they can still provide a service during the rainy season. It's also important in order to reduce the cost of delivering goods in every country, not just developing countries, but the evidence is from developing countries. As I said, it's not about having the adequate infrastructure, but it's also operating it properly or efficiently. And so we have evidence on like how increasing the efficiency of ports measured in different ways through the container port performance index that the World Bank produced and other measures of efficiency, that leads to a reduction on the shipping cost, the maritime shipping cost of exports. And it's also the way of like one of the many measures to improve efficiency that we see, or the factors, is like whether the ports are operated by the public or the private sector. So we see that ports that are operated by the private sector are more efficient on average than those operated by the public sector. Of course, it's an average effect, so there are always cases that that go in the other direction. But also we see that when there is a strong competition, as I mentioned before, that leads to uh, higher efficiency and lower maritime shipping cost. And lastly, it's about managing urban congestion. So the speed data that we have looked at across like 134 countries, we see that there's not much congestion in general uh, between cities, but as you get closer to cities, not just only within the city, but closer to the cities, is where congestion start like coming up, and that leads to a significant cost. Loss of time and cost in the operation of tracking services, and therefore an increase in the cost of transportation. So it's important to have the adequate infrastructure to manage the urban congestion. And this is not just about having necessarily more roads, but it's to having proper urban transportation alternatives and public transportation and alternatives to reduce the congestion and manage the agglomeration that happens in cities. So I told you before that we claim that in order to reduce economic distance, countries need to make sure that they are creating efficient markets, removing the frictions in those markets that leads to inefficient outcomes, and develop efficient places. But yes, you probably are thinking like examples of different countries, and yes, each country is differently. It's different. So we don't claim that there is a one size fit all, but we do strongly believe that these two elements should be part of any reform agenda in order to reduce the economic distance. At the same time, it's important to emphasize that creating efficient markets or having efficient markets will lead to, or let me put it the other way, if we don't have efficient markets and we focus only on having very good infrastructure efficiently operated, the benefits of those interventions to improve the performance of the infrastructure will not be fully realized if we don't have efficient markets. And in that, because what is going to happen, for example, is that maybe the reductions in time because of better infrastructure will be absorbed by the service provider, by the carrier, but it will not be translated or passed through to the shippers, to the owners of the cargo, the final users of the service. And so it is important to prioritize, but not in the sense of sequencing, but given a strong priority to creating efficient markets. And just to close, I have talked a lot about like evidence about what are frictions that are that we find in developing countries that push prices of transport services up, that push prices up, that lower the reliability of the services, and so on. And what are measures that can be taken by governments in order to remove those frictions. But we need to keep in mind a few things when governments will go and try to pick what are the policies for their own countries. And every country tends to or should strive to pick the policies that will yield the highest benefit. Obviously, the first step is to identify what are the frictions that you want to remove. It's not just like, don't shoot blindly. You need to know where you are targeting. Are those market failures? Are those policy-driven frictions? Is that the geography? Once we identify that, we can identify what are the policies that need to be implemented to remove those frictions. But those policies will have an effect not only on price, time, and reliability, but those will have an effect on economic outcomes. So improvements in the transport sector could lead to higher investments by the private sector, by the manufacturing and industrial sectors, more trade, to changes in the location of firms, to increases in productivity, potentially through agglomeration, to the creation of jobs, to a structural change, shift from agriculture to manufacturing, which will lead to higher income, potentially improve equity, and increase the sustainability of the economy. But we should not take that for granted, what I just said, because those effects will most likely, and what the evidence shows, will differ. There will be basically heterogeneous effects, heterogeneous impacts across space, across firms and people. Some regions might benefit more than others. Sometimes some regions might actually lose because of interventions, while others benefit. Same with firms and people. So policymakers will face trade-off when making these decisions, because who benefits, who does not, who benefits more or others. And it's important to understand the evidence that it's available and understand the theory of change to know what could happen with the potential policies that governments will have at hand in order to select the best one. I won't say what's the proper, but the best one, and knowing, and if some areas or some groups of people will be hurt by these policies, to take measures to deal with with the problem that the policy might generate. So that is key, and of course it's important when appraising these policies to properly assess what are going to be the changes in the economic outcomes, the economic impacts, whether these changes have a net social value, because, for example, there could be economic activity that relocates from one place to another. So is that creating some social value bringing something to the country, or is just moving from one place to another? So it's important to identify all of these issues in order to properly weigh the different effects and select the policy that will yield the highest possible benefit for the country. And I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for your presentation summarizing the main findings of the report, Shrinking Economic Distance. Thank you. We received some questions in advance, but also we received some questions during your presentations. So let me read, because of the interest of the time, let me read those questions all together and asking you to respond in a comprehensive manner. First one, we received 3 questions, but let me read the first one from Sasaki-san. Thank you very much. In your analysis, how does the level of regional integration affect the reduction of the transportation cost? For example, if we compare the regions such as East Asia, where regional integration is advanced, with South Asia, where regional integration is lagged, is there any obvious linkages between the transportation cost and regional integration? So this is the first question. Second question from Professor Yoshino of the Keio University. Thank you very much for your questions. Let me read. In order to mitigate time and money costs of trade in developing countries, it will require, first, digitalization in custom procedures, second, scanning systems to stop illegal trade, and the third, domestic infrastructure investment. Who will finance these technologies and cost? Is there ways for private investors to put their money in developing countries to improve those 3 elements? So this was a question from Professor Yoshino. Thank you very much. And the other question from Fedas Intaj. Thank you for your question. Let me read. Transportation is more powerful and influential ministry cabinet than foreign or even defense ministries cabinet in developing countries. The rich and poor gap is high in developing countries. So the transport industry is mostly public, and the little private transport industry is driven by monopoly industry monopoly by monopoly market in developing countries. Any positive improvement or modification of transport industry in terms of materials or mode would affect both public and private transport industry in developing countries and may even hinder the relationship with the neighboring countries. For example, if Bangladesh were a developed country like Australia, it might have two capitals. One is geographical and the other one is commercial, like Dhaka and Chittagong, like Sydney and Canberra in case of Australia. Making these kind of bold administrative changes require political will and continuity of the government leadership. The question about the government governance, government leadership in the public sector in the transport industry. So these are the points raised by our viewers. So I'd like to invite Matthias to come in to make the comprehensive responses. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So let me start with probably the easiest one to answer, which is the relationship between transport costs and regional integration. So, well, if we take it in that direction, higher transport costs limit the integration of countries, as we see it in, and we discussed it today. So that's in one side. First of all, higher transport costs to cross-border will limit integration, and it will hinder the integration at all levels: domestic, regional, and international. Now, when you see, and it's also the problem that goes on the other way, because like the problem of India and Bangladesh, they are not, and the whole South Asia region is not properly integrated, and it's not properly integrated for many reasons, I mean, or in many angles, but that creates these very thick borders. And those very thick borders that require, for example, the cargo to be transloaded from one vehicle to another, from the Bangladeshi truck to an Indian truck at the border, it takes significant time and cost. So it's, the effect goes both ways. These restrictions increase the cost. These are restrictions that create that leads or hinder the integration, increase the transport cost, and that leads to a lower or economic integration, because the trade between these countries that they are next to each other is much lower than what it could be if the borders were not so thick. So the relationship goes in both ways. Yeah, so digitalization of customs, I think the digitalization of all different links in the transport network, on the trade, so on the logistic network, will help increase the efficiency and so on of the operations and reduce the cost. And as I discussed, infrastructure is one of the important determinants of higher transport costs and times in developing countries. And yes, I agree, there is a significant, it's not cheap, it's not something that, I mean, we don't do it as part of this study, but there are other studies that we have produced at the World Bank and other institutions about how much is needed in terms of infrastructure investment every year or annually in different developing countries and in all developing regions, which are very significant numbers. And as we know, countries, not just in developing countries right now, but all across the world, the fiscal situation is quite constrained. So there's not enough public resources to fund and finance these investments, and that's one of the reasons where like private, governments and multilateral organizations like ours are trying to remove constraints hindering, or like in order, the constraints that hinder the mobilization of private capital. And that comes in different ways, right? So certain players will be willing or interested on participating on like financing infrastructure, and we see it across the world. And there will be different institutions, different private sector players that will be interested on the digitalization. So the point is, and it's outside of the scope of this report, and we can have a long discussion that is much more than the time that we have now. but there are different measures in order needed to mobilize private capital that goes way outside of the transport sector, because it's not just about the problem is not just about transport infrastructure, but the gaps exist in all: energy, digital, water and sanitation, and so on. So there is a need, but also there is, as we have been seeing, there is a limit about how much it can be mobilized in terms of private capital. But if we try to relate, even though it is outside of the scope of this study, but we try to relate, one of the key elements and messages that I have made is about creating efficient markets, that there are many frictions on the markets that impede players, and the markets are basically mostly private sector players, to participate there. They hinder their or tamper the desire and the incentives to invest, because they cannot reap the benefits, they cannot earn the profit that is commensurate to the risk that they are taking. And so they're not going to be remunerated well. They are not necessarily the same problems, but the same incentives are faced by those private sector players that might want to invest in infrastructure on digitalization. So there has to be an enabling environment for the private sector to come and provide the capital to finance these investments. But the governments had to have the resources, because at the end, it's taxpayers and users that will be funding this infrastructure investment, and they will be covering the cost of the financing. So it's important to keep in mind that where who is paying at the end for the infrastructure, for example. So some services are clear that there is a fee that is paid for those services, but others, like roads in many countries, there are no tolls. There's free to use, so the cost is covered through taxpayers. So that brings back the issue of the fiscal constraints. So it's a bottom line. It's a very complex situation that we are all trying to crack that nut, to mobilize more private capital in order to fill the gaps that are huge across the developing world. And the last question, I'm not sure that I fully understand, so I will try to answer it. But yes, in many developing countries, and it varies a lot by region, there are important, the government plays an important role in the provision of transport services. And here we're talking, when I talk about transport services, we are referring just to freight, which is the topic of the report, because the situation on public transportation or urban transport is it's different. And it's not clear what is the rationale in many cases for the public sector to be involved in the provision of freight transport services. That it's a clear, there's not a public good nature that the government needs to interfere there and intervene then to provide the services. There is a clear role and economic reasoning, rationale for the private sector to provide freight transport services. And so, yes, they are both public and private players in the industry, but the role of the public sector should be to play the role more of the setting the policies, setting the regulations, and providing the infrastructure that has a public good nature, where private sector will not be able to or willing to participate. But on the service side, that to me it's not very clear that there has to be a role, while there is a significant role in many countries historically and for political reasons. Then in other countries where we see a lot of frictions in the markets, they are created because of the transport sector has a very strong political power in many cases, or related to political power, that vested interests that don't want to step out of there and let the market work. So there is a lot of these transport unions, associations they have a strong political power. It's not that that's the reason why they exist. I mean, and they survive. And so it's not what we propose here is not easy topics to, or easy problems to solve. The political economy and the sectors is quite important. And yes, in some countries, the transport ministers are very important, but in many others, and I come from a developing country, many others like mine, the Ministry of Finance is one of the most important because it's trying to keep the macroeconomies like working properly, and in many cases that is ends up being a much more important problem than the sectoral problem. So I'm not sure if the point about the strong power that the transport ministry have in general was related to that. I might be not answering directly, but I think that it's country specific, and it's important to consider the political economy of the sectors in order to think about the policies that can be implemented and how should be implemented.
Great, thank you very much. We had the pleasure of having Matthias Herrera Dappe, the senior economist of the World Bank, who is one of the lead authors of the new report, Shrinking Economic Distance, Understanding How Markets and Places Can Lower Transport Costs in Developing Countries. Thank you very much, Matthias, for your time to present and also respond all the questions that we received. Thank you, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Super, thank you very much. This concludes the all World Bank Tokyo online morning seminars scheduled for the calendar year 2024. Thank you very much for joining the sessions. We actually had 23 online morning seminars for this year. Thank you. And we are going to take some breaks, but we'll be back in the week of January 6th to organize interesting online seminars and programs. So have a nice rest of the year. Happy New Year, and see you next time next year. Thank you very much.